So we left off in chapter 2 with Dink thinking that it was his fault that Wallace hasn't shown up, and that now they think he has been kidnapped. All right, so we have 2 chapters to read today. So chapter 3. Kidnapped, Ruth Rose shrieked. I'm gonna make this lower for you. Her blue eyes were huge. Josh and Dink covered their ears. Shh, said Josh. He handed the letter back to Dink and gave a quick gesture with his head. Some strange woman is watching us. Dink had noticed the woman earlier. She'd been sitting in the back of the book nook. She's coming over here, Ruth Rose said. The woman had brown hair up in a neat bun, half glasses perched on her nose. She was wearing a brown dress and brown shoes. She carried a book bag with a picture of a moose on the side. Around her neck, she wore a red scarf covered with tiny black letters. Excuse me, she said in a soft, trembly voice. Did you say Wallace has been kidnapped? The woman poked her glasses nervously. Dink wasn't sure what to say. He thought Wallace had been kidnapped, but he couldn't be sure. Finally, he said, well, he might have been. My goodness, gasped the woman. Who are you? Josh asked her. Oh, pardon me, the woman blushed. My name is Mavis Green. She mumbled. I'm a writer, and I came to meet Mr. Wallace. Dink said, I'm Dink Duncan. These are my friends Ruth Rose and Josh. Mavis shook hands shyly. Then she reached into her book bag and pulled out a folded paper. Wallace wrote to me last week. He said something very peculiar in his letter. I didn't think much of it at the time, but when he didn't show up today, and then I heard you mention kidnapping. She handed the letter to Dink. Josh and Ruth Rose read it over his shoulder. Dear Mavis, thank you for your note. I'm well and thank you for asking, but lately my imagination is playing tricks on me. I keep thinking I'm being followed. Maybe that's what happens to mystery writers. We start seeing bad guys in the shadows. At any rate, I'm eager to meet you in Green Lawn, and I'm looking forward to our lunch after the signing. Wallace. Wow, said Ruth Rose. First he says he's being followed, and then he winds up missing. Dink told Mavis about his letter from Wallace. He said the only thing that would keep him from coming today was if he was kidnapped. Oh dear, said Mavis. I just don't understand. Why would anyone want to kidnap Wallace? If he's the most famous mystery writer in the world, he must be rich, right? Said Josh. Or Josh said, maybe someone kidnapped him for ransom. Suddenly, Josh grabbed Dink and spun him around, pointing toward the street. Look, the cops are coming. They must have heard about the kidnapping. A police officer was walking toward them. Josh, that's Officer Fallon, Jimmy Fallon's grandfather, said Dink. Jimmy came to get a book signed. I saw him inside the book nook. Maybe we should show Officer Fallon these letters, Ruth Rose suggested. They could be clues if Wallace has really been kidnapped. Who's been kidnapped, Officer Fallon? Asked Officer Fallon, who was now standing near them. Not my grandson, I hope, he added, grinning. Dink showed Officer Fallon the 2 letters. We think Wallace might have been kidnapped, he said. He promised he'd come to sign books, but he isn't here. Officer Fallon read Mavis's letter first, then Dink's. He scratched his chin, then handed the letters back. The letters do sound a bit suspicious, he said, but it's more likely that Mr. Wallace just missed his flight. Jimmy Fallon ran out of the book nook, waving a Wallace Wallace book at his grandfather. Grandpa, he never came. Can we go for ice cream anyway? Officer Fallon put a big hand on Jimmy's head. In a minute, son. To Dink, he said, I wouldn't worry, Mr. Wallace will turn up. Call me tomorrow if there's no news, okay? They watched Jimmy and his grandfather walk away. Dink handed Mavis's letter back to her. He folded his and slid it into his pocket. Crazy thoughts were bouncing around in his head. What if Wallace Wallace really has been kidnapped? It happened because I invited him to Green Lawn. I'm practically an accomplice. I don't want to wait till tomorrow, he said finally. I say we start looking for Wallace Wallace now. Where do we start? Ruth Rose asked. Dink jerked his thumb over his shoulder. Right here at the book nook. Excuse me, Mavis Green said shyly. May I come along too? Sure, Dink said. He marched back inside the book nook with the others following. Mr. Paskey was putting the Wallace Wallace books back on a shelf. He looked even more nervous than before. Excuse me, Mr. Paskey, Dink said. Have you heard from Wallace Wallace? Mr. Paskey's hand shot up to his bow tie. No, Dink, not a word. We think he was kidnapped, Josh said. Mr. Paskey swallowed, making his bow tie wiggle. Now, Joshua, let's not jump to conclusions. I'm sure there's a rational explanation for his absence. Dink told Mr. Paskey about the 2 letters. I'm really worried, Mr. Paskey. Where could he be? Mr. Paskey took out a handkerchief and wiped his face. I have no idea. He removed a paper from his desk and handed it to Dink. All I have is his itinerary. The others looked over Dink's shoulder as he read. Arrive at Bradley Airport at 7 p.m. Friday, July 15th. New England Airlines, Flight 3132. 2. Meet driver from Lawrence Taxi Service. 3. Drive to Shangri-La Hotel. 4. Sign books at Book Nook at 11 a.m. Saturday, July 16th. 5. Lunch, then back to airport for 4:30 p.m. flight. Can I keep this? Dink asked Mr. Paskey. Mr. Paskey blinked. Well, I guess that'll be all right, but why do you need the itinerary? Dink picked up a marker and drew circles around the words. Airport, taxi, hotel, and Book Nook. This is like a trail. It leads from the airport last night to the Book Nook today, Dink said. Somewhere along this trail, Wallace Wallace disappeared. Dink stared at the itinerary. And we're going to find him. All right, chapter 4. Mr. Paskey shooed them out of the Book Nook and locked the front door. I have to eat lunch, he said. He scurried down Main Street. Come on, Dink said. There's a phone in Ellie's diner. Good, we can eat while you're calling. Josh stopped. Who are you calling? The airport, Dink said, to see if Wallace Wallace was on that 7 o'clock flight last night. They walked into Ellie's diner just as Jimmy Fallon and his grandfather came out. Jimmy was working on a triple-decker chocolate cone. Ellie stood behind the counter, as usual. Her apron was smeared with ketchup, mustard, chocolate, and a lot of stuff Dink didn't recognize. Ellie smiled. Hi, Dink. Butter crunch, right? Dink shook his head. No thanks, Ellie. I came to use the phone. Excuse me, but would it be all right if I bought you each a cone? Mavis Green asked. I was going to buy lunch for Mr. Wallace anyway. Gee, thanks, Josh said. I'll have a scoop of mint chip and a scoop of pistachio. Oh, you like green ice cream too? Mavis said. She smiled shyly. I'll have the same, please. I like pink ice cream, Ruth Rose said. I'll have a strawberry cone, please. 1 scoop. How about you, Dink? Mavis asked. I'm not hungry, thanks, he said. But you guys go ahead. I'm going to call the airport. Dink felt guilty. If he hadn't invited Wallace Wallace to Green Lawn, his favorite author would be safe at home in his castle in Maine. But Dink couldn't help feeling excited, too. He felt like a detective from one of Wallace Wallace's books. Dink stepped into the phone booth, looked up the number for New England Airlines, and called. When a voice came on, he asked if Wallace Wallace had been aboard flight 3132 last night. He was? Did it land at 7 o'clock? Dink asked. Thanks a lot. He rushed out of the phone booth. Hey guys, they told me Wallace Wallace was on the plane, and it landed right on time. So he didn't miss his flight, Ruth Rose said through strawberry pink lips. That's right, Dink. Dink pulled out the itinerary. He drew a line through airport. This is so exciting, Ruth Rose said. Now what? Josh asked, working on his double dipper. Dink pointed to his next circle on the itinerary. Now we need to find out if a taxi picked him up, he said. Lauren's taxi is over by the river, Ruth Rose said. Dink looked at Mavis. Would you like to come with us? We can walk there in 5 minutes. Mavis Green wiped her lips carefully with a napkin. I'd love to come, she said in her soft voice. They left Ellie Steiner, walked left on Bridge Lane, then headed down Woodview Road toward the river. Mr. Paskey looked pretty upset, didn't he? Josh said, crunching the last of his cone. His chin was green. Wouldn't you be upset if you had a bunch of customers at your store waiting to meet up a famous author and he didn't show up? Ruth Rose asked. Yeah, but he was sweating buckets, Josh said. I wonder if Mr. Paskey kidnapped Wallace Wallace. Josh, get real. Why would Mr. Paskey kidnap an author? Asked Ruth Rose. He sells tons of Wallace Wallace's books. All right, so we are not going to read the end of chapter 4 because we have about 45 seconds until 10 o'clock. So we'll end there.